So with that said, you can imagine what would happen if even 25% of them started to headquarter in Sealand, a place which I don't even think has a corporate tax structure. I mean, it would just be absolutely freaking hilarious.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, the irony in all this is that this actually played out in France back in 2014, 2015 timeframe. Now, go ahead, get on Google right now, look up French news articles from 2014, 2015. What you'll find is that the progressive wing in the French government said exactly this. The billionaires are getting richer. The poor class is getting poorer. It's about time those greedy billionaires paid their fair share. We need to impose a wealth tax on the wealthiest among us and redistribute that wealth to the people who actually deserve it. Well, what happened over the next year? Some 42,000 millionaires living in France sold their properties and said sayonara. They just left the country, and which of course made the situation even worse, because the richest among them were already paying a significant portion of the tax revenue to the French government. When a wealth tax was imposed, the people had the means, so they just left. And that's exactly what Filthy just described. So we don't need to imagine what's going to happen. We already know, because it's been tried by other countries.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to see this in a bit more of a permanent way. And we know that tax revenues that tax rates are only going to increase as time goes on, because the process by which, remember we were talking about earlier with the, with the Chinese banks and how insolvent they were? Mm-hmm. A lot of what I didn't mention earlier, and this is actually mentioned in the Bloomberg article, is that a lot of these banks actually are over-leveraged. They actually are increasingly insolvent. And you're seeing a lot of things like the Chinese central banks and the Chinese finance ministry is authorizing and even mandating that smaller banks sell their assets and consolidate with larger banks, specifically to try to shore up their assets and to try to maintain some liquidity. Now, while it is somewhat unknown, it is known within the finance institution that banks are always going to be selling, trading, and just generally, like, there's a constant churn among finance firms. Like, this is normal. Fact of the matter is, like, if you aren't buying up smaller firms, you're dying. Now, how much of that has to do with just how finance works in general, or has to do with the extent to which the finance industry is the most heavily restricted industry in the United States, with the exception of healthcare and nuclear energy, I don't know for sure. But I do know that, well, this is being done specifically because these Chinese banks simply do not have the assets. They are insolvent, and they simply cannot function the way that they are right now. And everything they're doing right now is just based on this trope that I've been saying for a while now, keeping the lights on for another 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And, well, yeah.
And I mean, I think that really, when you think about the world economy as a whole, all that's really happening is, you know, the smoke and mirrors game and currency manipulation to try to make people believe that assets exist that don't really exist. As I was just saying, the billionaires aren't getting richer. They don't own anything more than they did before. It's just nominally, because of all this liquidity that's being injected into the system, it looks like those assets are worth way more than they are. When in reality, if everyone sold at the same time, you'd realize they actually aren't worth that much. If half the U.S. population is unemployed, which, I mean, who knows what the actual effective unemployment rate is, but and around the world, then that means that people aren't going to work, which means that goods and services aren't being produced. If goods and services aren't being produced, then real wealth, the things that people want and need to make their lives go around, isn't being produced. You can hide that. Yeah, you can move things around on paper to try and hide it. You can do it successfully for months or maybe even years. But if history proves anything, it's that sooner or later supply and demand wins out. People realize that the goods and services they're being told that they would be able to buy, that they want, that they're counting their futures on, aren't there. And when that happens, the whole system comes crashing down.
It's honestly, it's beautiful.
Indeed, indeed.
So let's see here. What else is going on?
All right, next thing that I thought we should discuss was this mass tracking COVID pass article that you shared from Zero Hedge.
Oh yeah, so that's from a while ago, actually.
It was a while ago, but since we've missed a couple of shows, I thought it's worth discussing. It's been probably a couple months now since we first brought up Bill Gates and ID 2020. But to refresh everyone's memory, for a while now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been funding a project called ID 2020, which basically advocates creating a digital identity for every person on Earth. It would be it's an identity that you would carry through either some sort of tattoo or microchip that would be implanted in your body that basically biometrically connects both your biological signature and who you are as a person. All your future digital currency would be stored in a government-issued digital wallet on that chip. Access to your bank accounts, the records where you travel, the systems you use, all that would be located on your person. And we're told this is for your own protection because it would make it virtually impossible for anyone to impersonate you and or steal anything that you own, which, to be fair, is true. It would also remove any meaningful sense of privacy because it would effectively allow the government to track where you are, where you go, what you're spending your money on, who you're having communication with. I mean, any effort to shield that from the government would go away entirely. But yet, that is what effectively what ID 2020 is. Now, this whole global pandemic thing has been the perfect stepping stone, if you will, to leap forward with technologies that will take this out of the realm of science fiction and make it a reality. And one such technology is what is now being called COVID Pass. So reading from an article here on Zero Hedge, COVID Pass is being developed in partnership with a British cybersecurity company, and it would effectively be what they call a digital health passport. Your vaccination records, whether or not you have had COVID-19 or perhaps any other relevant pandemic-type viruses in the future, would be stored on this digital passport. And as you travel around, as you get on a train, as you get on a plane, as you enter a restaurant, you would be required to scan your cell phone, or heck, if it's a chip in your arm or whatever it is, and it would effectively bring up your health records, whether or not you've received a vaccination for COVID-19. And if you haven't received such a vaccination, businesses by law would be required to tell you, sorry, we can't let you in here until such time as you receive vaccination. Now, and this would, in this case, even if the vaccination is voluntary, it would make it virtually impossible to do business or go anywhere or do anything unless you accept the state's mandatory vaccinations.
Naturally, I mean, this is exactly what we were talking about since like March. And we see you got a super chat from Pumpkin Row. Shout out to coronavirus being government made. Yeah, we've talked about from the very beginning that this was almost certainly government caused. It eventually came out that this was manufactured in a Wuhan lab. That the Chinese, and we found out that the Chinese government knew about this since even late 2019, December of 2019, and refused to tell anyone about it. And there's even instances that this was a bioweapon.
Yes. In fact, deliberately fed false information to the World Health Organization.
And the World Health Organization is a proxy of the Chinese government, so it's hardly surprising. But we pretty much knew since March that this was, whether this was because it was intentional or like an intentional plan on the part of the United States government or Western governments, or or them trying to make the best of a crisis, as Rahm Emanuel used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. They basically began to use this as a tool of tyrannization and exploitation of citizens. With this in mind, yeah, this is exactly what we were talking about is going to happen. That they were going to make a vaccine, they were going to make it mandatory, and in the sense, they weren't going to make it mandatory, like they probably will in some European countries, but the modus operandi nowadays with when they want to make something mandatory is that they don't actually make it mandatory. They make it so economically expensive through their various means of economic intervention to mandate that people do certain or treat people who don't comply in certain ways. In this case, as you talked about before, they're going to be making it they're going to require people scan their COVID passes in order to be able to use public transit, to be able to get a job, to be able to get an apartment, to be able to do a whole bunch of other things. Just simple economic participation in the white market is going to be significantly more restricted because you did not comply with with the vaccine that is mandatory. And of course, Trump tweeted out not long ago that he is going to get the military to distribute the vaccines. And I can already hear, in the moment I read that tweet, I could basically make out that weird sound I was hearing throughout the entire day. I don't know if you were hearing it either, Sense. Were you? The sound of Bill Gates' wallet giggling with excitement.
Yeah, so that's what that was.
It was so loud I could hear it from Texas. I don't even know where he lives.
Presumably in California, isn't that where they all live?
I don't know. But
I guarantee you he owns property there.
He almost certainly does, and he probably owns the entire state of Nevada too. Now, with that said, yeah, where was I going with this? Okay. So yeah, you have the sorry.
I wanted to say, I think it's interesting that this is coming, and this is also coming about at the time where the other huge national narrative going on right now is defund the police. And national media is talking everywhere about how police brutality and racism is such a horrible national issue, and we need to, get rid of these horrible police officers, which there's a legitimate discussion to be had there, and we did talk about that on a previous stream. But it's interesting that is a particular narrative going on right now, because we know that instrumental in making this COVID pass a reality is the government's ability to enforce it. And to enforce it, you're going to need a police force. But of course, the greatest danger that I see to this not becoming a reality is the decentralization of the current law enforcement system. Now, do I think there are problems with local police? Absolutely. But also, if we can see that with these government-mandated lockdowns that have taken place across the United States, what really affects whether or not people are wearing masks or going out is the willingness of the local departments to enforce these certain measures. If various local departments are too small, or because the local sheriff or police chief has a disagreement with some larger state or national policy, some departments are saying, we're just not going to enforce it because we either disagree with the measure or we don't have the means to enforce it. So the people in those cities and counties get away with not following the mandates. So it's I don't think a coincidence then that there's this huge national movement against police, but in particular, if you look at these reports, it's all local police departments, it's local municipalities. It's not the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it's not the U.S. Marshal Service or the military or any other federal centralized arm that the state might use to enforce its COVID-19 policies. So I think we see simultaneously there's a move to get rid of decentralized law enforcement in favor of a larger centralized law enforcement system. They won't call it that, obviously, but it's going to be a system of enforcers that will then be responsible, ideally placed, to pair with these new policies that will now be that much easier to enforce without competing state factions, such as those that are potentially represented by local police departments.
I think it's a pretty good point that doesn't get brought up, and you're seeing this a lot about how the protests and riots in general are being used for centralization, not only just in law enforcement, as you pointed out, but also in economically. I think we talked about before how police would direct rioters towards districts and cities where there were a lot of small businesses. And this, of course, if a small business is destroyed, this frees up market share for large state-backed cartels like Walmart.
And make no mistake, regardless of who wins, I mean the state ultimately wins, but at the end, but the various factions that are fighting for control of that state are indeed real, and the heat that's taking place between the political factions we have right now demonstrates just how desperate they are to take control before this happens.
Yeah, and this is very much like their last chance at trying to achieve their agenda. I mean, I think I can feel the pressure as well, in all honesty, that this is the jig is up, basically, for lack of a better term. They have to get their agenda now because pretty soon there's not going to be much of a crisis left. People are going to be burnt out. People are going to get sick of it, and a whole lot of things that have been in place for a long time, a lot of these cycles, for lack of a better term, are really coming to an end. And now is the time to, if you have this kind of agenda, if you're a true believer, now is your last chance. Now I'm trying to think of what other ways to put this, because it does very much sound like that defunding the police is definitely going to be the agenda. And I've always known for a long time that... Crap, I lost my train of thought. So let me just give me a moment here to try to recollect my thoughts.
No problem.
So yeah, the kind of centralization in legislation enforcement definitely seems very, very likely. You can imagine that in places like New York City, in the city where, let's see here, on May 25th, a police officer charged a homeless person with assault against them for quote-unquote bruised knuckles. Take a few guesses as to how that officer got bruised knuckles. According to the officer, the man kicked him in the hand. That's how he got bruised knuckles. Now, how do you think he actually got bruised knuckles?
Probably while he was beating the crap out of the homeless person.
Of course. And there's the body cam footage to show this. So, yeah, that's entirely what's been going on. And it's kind of funny, too, when you hear a lot of conservatives and a lot of conservative outlets, for example, Bucker Barrelson, talking about how police officers need to be protected, how they need things like qualified immunity to make sure that they aren't unjustly prosecuted. And meanwhile, they do things like this. I've known for a long time these people are controlled opposition, but come on. Now, with this in mind, it does go without saying, I think I kind of went off topic there, rather went off the point that I was trying to make, which is that you have Minnesota, which is largely dismantled its police department, thank God, and you have the NYPD, which saw 20% of its budget cut as well. Now, I think I've made the case in a previous stream that this is being done because these localities were already hurting financially, and this was just a very convenient excuse for them to, one, cut their budgets and save money, as well as, two, make it sound like they actually care about what people think, when what's actually going on is that this is just them responding to economic forces that were already in place. But with that said, yeah, I lost my train of thought again. I'm going my mind is going a mile a minute. Oh yeah, now I remember. So, okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm being terrible right now. Anyways, so with all of these localities that are cutting their police departments, you can imagine that in a couple months or a couple years from now, that they're going to start asking for federal legislation enforcers to help them out, quote unquote. Because, well, I'm pretty sure you've seen the statistics that New York City is experiencing a massive crime wave as a result that they're blaming on these budget cuts.
Absolutely.
I don't know if they are. I don't know how much of that is true or not. But for the sake of argument, I'm willing to take them at their word. So
and I will say the other reason, you can continue, I'm just going to say, the other reason I'm willing to take them at their word is because these cities that are seeing the huge crime surges after cutting their police budget, New York, Chicago, they're also the cities with the strictest gun control legislation. So for years, the rank-and-file citizen has been unable to obtain the tools he would need to protect himself without the help of the police. So in other parts of the country where police budgets are getting cut, we don't see a corresponding rise in crime. But we do see it in cities where the citizens aren't armed and able to protect themselves.
Hell, I think in places like Atlanta, which, although it does have some pretty strict gun-controlled legislation, its crime has actually gone down significantly. Now, with that said, yeah, you're going to see a whole lot of cities in the future begging for federal legislation enforcers to basically help them out because they're being overwhelmed and we're big babies, that sort of thing. And that's what I think is largely going to result in this centralization that I was just talking about. It's just going to be the cities are going to beg for it, basically.
Exactly, and they'll bring them in. My guess is they'll call them something other than police. I mean, you think of like the peacekeepers from the Hunger Games or something of that nature.
Oh, I know what they'll be called. They'll be called advisors.
Yeah, advisors or something of that nature. You effectively replace the local police department with a completely centralized law enforcement agency, given a name other than law enforcement, so as to take away the fears from the people who are screaming Black Lives Matter, defund police. But effectively, they'll be doing exactly the same thing, just now they'll be doing it under centralized direction and primarily to enforce these COVID Pass and ID 2020 and other centralized control measures that the state wants to implement.
I mean, I criticize police a lot, but a lot of the kernels of liberty that we are seeing in this pandemic has been like local sheriffs publicly stating that they will direct the departments to not enforce any of these ridiculous restrictions, lockdown orders, that sort of thing. I know in my county, my local sheriff has stated that the mandatory mask order from our imperial overlord, aka Rick Perry, he's decided that, yeah, we're not enforcing that at all, ever. Which, thank goodness for that. I'm still going to be critical of police, but I mean, I'm willing to give credit where credit is due.
I agree, and I'd say I'm still critical of police as an institution, although I do believe individual police officers and sheriffs can certainly do the right thing, and often do, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we're about 45 minutes in. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover for this stream. So with what time we have left, I see we have 27 people watching right now. If anybody's got any comments or questions that you'd like us to address, by all means, go ahead and put them in the chat now.
Actually, there was a few other things that we were pointing out that we were posting that I think I wanted to talk about.
Oh, go right ahead then.
For example, the Army's official Twitch page is doing something very, very shady in terms of military recruitment. I don't know if you saw that video, but from what it sounds like, the Army's official Twitch page, which, I mean, the Army has had an interesting relationship with gaming in the sense that they have their own official esports team. They do their own like gaming channels to, you know, try to entice people to join the Army. Now, you can go back and forth as to whether or not that is a legitimate tactic to try to get people into becoming cannon fodder for the state. I mean, but as far as tactics go, that's actually fairly good, fairly admirable, actually. That they're just trying to, you know, reach out to people in ways that they would actually find interesting. However, what they've been doing recently is that they've been doing a giveaway for, if I recall correctly, a special console controller, or a special like limited edition controller. However, the link for the giveaway leads the person to an Army recruiting site where you can sign up online to effectively join the Army. And this is, of course, raising a bunch of red flags, because if you're doing a giveaway and it leads to an Army site, you can imagine some clueless 16-year-old who probably wants to get some special Fortnite stuff, goes on there, signs up to join the Army, thinking that this is how they sign up for the giveaway. This is like very fraudulent and very shady, to say the least. I don't know if they do this a lot or if they'll keep doing this, but I mean, I'm glad that people are at least pointing it out and that people are giving them crap for it, because yeah, that is just absolutely freaking disgusting.
It's funny. It makes me think of, have you seen that episode of Family Guy where Army recruiters come to Chris's high school? Later in the episode, Brian takes Stewie to the Army recruiter's office to chew him out. But what instead ends up happening is Stewie walks into the office and signs both him and Brian up to join the Army, and then before they know it, they get shipped off to boot camp.
No, I don't watch Family Guy.
Okay, well, yeah, just it was kind of making fun of all the things the U.S. Army will promise you in order to, if you join the Army. Of course, all of them being vastly unrealistic. Like they show this video presentation of soldiers jumping into piles of money while girls in bikinis are jumping all over them, and it's like the U.S. Army. Oh yeah, your experience may vary. And then and then of course, when Brian goes to the office not to join the army but to chew out the army recruiter, and instead Stewie walks in, signs 2 pieces of paper, and inadvertently causes him and Brian to join the army. So.
Yeah, and I understand that there has been a significant crisis in army recruitment recently, but so what? It means that people don't want to join the army. That's not a bad thing. I mean, no, there's really nothing else to that. There's no reason to want to join it. For one thing, everyone's sick of these infinite, endless wars that are going on, and giving the lying sociopaths to get us into these wars, giving them less of an ability to send cannon fodder to fight for them on their behalf. That's a good thing. However, keep in mind that there's a not zero chance that they could just reinstitute a draft again. I mean, they already have all that infrastructure in place. All they need to do is just institute it again.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up, because there's actually a news article, I just remember now, I saw it earlier this week. I didn't think to put it as something for us to discuss, but it was on Tucker Carlson. It was a clip from Tucker Carlson where, you know, Tucker Carlson, of course, is one of the media talking heads who says he's anti-war. And he was talking about how the war in Afghanistan is now officially the longest war in U.S. history. And what can we do to finally put an end to the war in Afghanistan? And who is Tucker Carlson going to bring on his show? The expert he's going to bring on his show to talk about how important it is to end the war in Afghanistan? Eric Prince. Now, I hope everyone knows who Eric Prince is. Eric Prince is the founder of the organization previously known as Blackwater USA. It has since taken on a different iteration. I forget what they're calling it now. But essentially, it's a very large mercenary firm known to have committed numerous crimes, but the United States government nonetheless has contracted them, and Eric Prince and his cronies have been making quite a bit of money off the backs of endless wars in the Middle East. Well, what is Eric Prince's solution? We should end the war in Afghanistan, bring the U.S. troops home right now, and, of course, pass on any necessary military duties to great military contractors like him and his organization. Which, incidentally, his organization is also accepting contracts with the Chinese government to help enforce their policies in East Asia, but Tucker Carlson seemingly didn't mention that at all. So it's funny because we have mainstream media talking heads who repeat these same talking points. The U.S. needs to get out of endless wars. The war in Afghanistan is pointless. And, oh, yeah, what should we do about it? Pass it on to government contractors, privatize, not privatize in the true sense of the word, but privatize these wars so that corrupt, known criminals can make more money off their backs.
Well, I don't see any conflict of interest there at all. I don't know what you're getting at, my 2 cents, but I don't see any reason why we should be concerned about the motives of people who say, like, oh, we should just end the wars by bringing all the troops home and relegating all military duties to my organization. I don't see any kind of conflict of interest there at all. I mean, are you sure you're not some crazy conspiracy theorist?
Yeah. I'd still love to know what the U.S. government's official explanation is for why we're still in Afghanistan.
Well, their official explanation is potatoes.
I actually did a Google search the other day. What is the Department of Defense official reason for why we're still in Afghanistan? I couldn't find a single article.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't even know why we were in Afghanistan in the first place.
Well, of course, the official answer we were given was to go after bin Laden and to ensure that the country did not become a safe haven for terrorists again in the future. But it's clear by now that it's well past that explanation.
Oh, yeah. As far as I'm aware, like, they're thousands of miles away. They're not really much of a threat, and the only reason that they were a threat to begin with is because of the CIA training the Mujahideen. I mean, are we going to forget that, what's his name, Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset at one point?
Oh, he was. In 1979, the CIA happily gave him arms, heavy amounts of money and weapons in order to take on the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Oh,
yeah. And the whole point was part of a strategy to try to undermine the Soviet Union in its main economic weak points.
The irony being, all these wars we're fighting against the United States. Essentially props someone up, then later tears them down. Props someone else up, tears them down. So we defeat one dangerous enemy by propping up our future enemies.
It's honestly a kind of a remarkable thing. In a very monstrous sort of way, it's very cosmic. It's a cosmic comedy. It's hard to articulate. I can't think right now. But yeah, let's see here. The next thing I want to talk about is that this is starting to make its way around Knitter, which is kind of hilarious. That is that face masks, which are mandatory by the United Kingdom government, as well as multiple states throughout the United States, they're now producing labels on the packaging that say, let me see if I can't get an example on my screen right here. So this is what it says on the box for these masks. Warning, this product is an ear loop mask. This product is not a respirator and will not provide any protection against COVID-19 coronavirus or other viruses or contaminants.
Yet you must wear one.
Yet you must wear one. God, the people who claim to control us, they're evil. There's really no other way around it.
I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. People have stitched together the footage of Dr. Fauci just back in February saying, do not wear a face mask. It will not help. In fact, it might even increase the risk that you get COVID-19. And then just a couple weeks ago, and then, they put that footage right next to him just a couple weeks ago, urging the American people to wear a face mask. It's so important for your safety and not spreading COVID-19. And some media talking heads even approached him about this and said, hey, I mean, what do you have to say about the fact that you first told us do not wear a face mask? It could make the matter worse. Now you're telling us wear a face mask. And he's like, well, I said don't wear a face mask at first because I was afraid that if everybody ran out and tried to get face masks, the healthcare workers and other at-risk people wouldn't have enough face masks. And one thing I wish someone would have said is, okay, let's take you at your word. You just admitted that you flat out lied to the American people and prevented them from obtaining something that may have improved their safety because you were afraid that healthcare workers or the people you felt needed it better would run out. So if you flat out lied to the American people then, how can we trust a word coming out of your mouth now? Why is nobody asking him this question?
Well, because they agree with everything he says. They're not there to, report. This is actually kind of something that drives me crazy about people's interpretation of how reporting actually works. People just assume that they're, critical. They're going to be asking questions. They're not there to ask questions. They're not there to be critical. They're not there to even figure out information. They're there to propagandize. They're there to preach. They're, quite frankly, I would hesitate to use this term, but I think they're a modern priesthood. Well, not really a modern priesthood. They're more along the lines of a modern lay clergy.
They're like the guys in the streets who, drum up interest in the priests who are actually at the temple.
Yeah, pretty much. They're just there. They're not there for your interests. They're there for the interests of the ruling priesthood.
I like this. JC Armitage says, I wonder how much benefit bank robbers are getting from these mandatory mask legislations.
Quite a lot, I would imagine. If you recall that, the mandatory mask legislation is only symptomatic. If you recall correctly, the payment protection program, that whole thing about hundreds of millions of dollars being given to small businesses, yeah, that was distributed through banks. And if you think that they didn't get a massive cut from their distribution, I think you're deluded.
Oh, of course. And, further reinforces my theory about why the stock market is going up so high. Well, people are unemployed and consumer prices remain the same.
No, it's fraudulent. Everything about this is just don't believe your lying eyes. Or rather, don't believe what the lying liars are telling you.
Absolutely. And further to J.C. Armish's point, in a previous stream, we brought up the fact that many states already have laws on the books against wearing a mask in public. So by telling people they must wear a mask, they've effectively created a catch-22 where under current law, if you go outside without wearing a mask, you're breaking the law. If you go outside wearing a mask, you're breaking the law. So
it's even funnier when you remember that with certain statutes involving concealed carry, you can't be a concealed carrier if you're wearing face coverings. So fact of the matter is, like, you're basically forced to choose between being able to defend yourself or being in compliance.
Society. And that's the aggravating part. You're playing these mental gymnastics where it's like, we got to bend the knee to you. You're going to be the arbitrator about what I can and can't say.
Hey guys, today's show is brought to you by Heshi Socks. Heshi Socks are my favorite socks in the world. You have to go buy a pair and try them on. They will change your life. If you've ever had your feet hurting after a day in dress shoes going to work, go to HeshiSocks.com. They will solve this problem for you. Most fashion and dress socks are expensive. They're poorly constructed, and they provide zero protection. Not Heshi Socks. Heshi Socks are cushioned in the heel, foot, and toe. They have arch support in the center so your feet don't slosh around in your shoes. Best of all, they're designed to stay up, so you don't have to pull up at your socks all day long. They're made with breathable Pima cotton, and they're antimicrobial to kill the stink. So your feet are going to feel good and smell good, and you're going to look good. Go to HeshiSocks.com. That's HeshiSocks.com. You guys are going to love these socks. Use promo code PROBLEM30 for 30% off your entire order. They have basic ankle, dress socks, anything you need. HeshiSocks.com, promo code PROBLEM30. All right, let's start the show.
Fill her up.
You're listening to the Gas Digital Network.
We need to roll back the state. We spy on all of our own citizens. Our prisons are flooded with nonviolent drug offenders. If you want to know who America's next enemy is, look at who we're funding right now. Every single one of these problems are a result of government being way too big.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network. Here's your host, Dave Smith.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of Part of the Problem. The crossover saga continues with the great Michael Malice, who is looking fresh and clean today, ready to go. There we go. I like it. Here's you've gone through all types of different phases of hair in this in the pandemic, and this is a sign that we're getting back to the new normal.
I went to my hair guy with 101 lesbian hairstyles. Look. And I said, we're going through it. And we did it. Last one.
There you go. So something was accomplished in these last few months. So I guess we should announce.
Those ladies sure are ornery. I've never been hit on so much in my life by all these sexy women.
Yeah, well, you've got options now. You can play this a number of different ways. So there is some unfortunate news that I guess we should start off by announcing. I literally just a few minutes ago looked down and saw the email, but Freedom Fest has been canceled. Sucks. Those guys really did everything they could to make it happen under pretty difficult conditions to organize a big festival, and then the state of Nevada just basically pulled the rug out from under them. Recently announced that they're going back from phase 3 to phase 2, and they said like they couldn't have gatherings of more than 49 people, and there's just no way to do Freedom Fest like that.
Why didn't they just rename it Black Lives Matter Fest, and then no one would have any problems getting sick? Yeah,
it is true. In fact, we'd probably be slowing down the spread if we were doing a Black Lives Matter Fest, or even just celebrating gay culture or something like that. I think that's okay too. It's just obviously it's got to be a left-wing cause. We could just pick a different left-wing cause, and I'm sure that would be fine too. It's just, well, what are you going to do? Really, by the way, and I know we've mentioned this before, and this isn't the topic of today's episode, but I have pointed this out, and I think it should be repeated a lot, that really everything about COVID from the leftist perspective should be a good thing. Everything about it. The people it's killed, the economic activity it's slowed down. Because if you really believe that climate change is this existential threat to the world, and as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren all said, it's going to make life, what was Bernie Sanders' line? I think it will make the planet uninhabitable for our children and grandchildren, which I always thought grandchildren was a little bit unnecessary.
I also like the idea that, like, if the temperature is 2 degrees higher, it's just like, well, I can't live like this.
Yes, that's right. But carbon emissions could not have been slowed down more. You couldn't have imagined anything that would do it.
I'm going to make a point, which when your Facebook friend brings up climate change, to throw in their face, because I think this is germane. As you probably know, Dave, and I'm sure a lot of listeners know, I have a background in zoology. My first job was writing for an aquarium magazine. The claim is that if temperature on average goes up 2 degrees or whatever, 1 degree, that it's going to be devastating for the oceans and the coral reefs. So when someone says this to you, ask them, how is it possible, if that's true, for corals to be held in home aquariums, where the temperature in no one's home is stable within 1 degree? And when you ask them, they don't have an answer, you don't have to follow up. But they're making this crazy claim that's very extreme. That 1 degree and it's systemic collapse ocean-wide. I'm not buying it. But that's just something to put out there.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent tool to use. Okay, so this episode, here's the bad news: Freedom Fest is canceled. But the good news is we have the episode that a lot of people have been waiting for. It's the Anatomy of the State episode, because you finally read it, and now we can discuss it. I want to say, before I get your thoughts, which I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about the it's kind of a pamphlet, longer than an essay, shorter than a book. It's somewhere in that range. I read Anatomy of the State, I believe, maybe 11 or 12 years ago. I think it was 2009 when I read it first. And I read it before I was an anarchist. And you're reading it after having been an anarchist for many years. So I'm sure that, has like a different perspective. It was very powerful to me. I had never heard these ideas put quite that way before. But you, I know you had said that you really hadn't read that much Rothbard. I think in writing your last book, The New Right, you started to read some of his stuff. Yeah. So, okay, just with that. And also I wanted to say that Anatomy of the State is, for me, a foundational work that I recommend to other people as one of the first go-tos if they're interested in reading about this stuff.
I think whenever I say anything that in any way can be construed as not glamorizing Rothbard, it comes off as either I'm just trying to fuck with people or something like that. So
why would you shit on Murray Rothbard like that? Why would you take shots at the great Murray Rothbard?
You said it yourself. It's a foundational text, right? I'll tell you a funny story. I was at there's a drag queen in Willem, and Willem has a song called Apologize, which is a cover of a song called Apologize by some band of like black guys. And I had never heard the song Apologize. And I was at a restaurant or something, and it came on, and I'm like, why would they be covering Willem? Because I had heard Willem's song first, then I heard that one. So because this book is so influential, this essay is so influential, I felt like I wasn't learning anything I didn't know. I feel like it's the kind of thing that or I disagreed with. I feel like this is the kind of thing where if you're 50 and you read Catcher in the Rye, you're like, it's not, I don't know that anyone who's this deep in anarchism and spreading very heavily Venn diagrammed with Murray Rothbard's ideas as their kind of vocation would read this and be like, oh my God. And because it's very foundational, very, I don't want to say one-on-one in terms of the concepts aren't strong and thought out, but it is very much, I could see it being the red pill where someone's like, for me, what this would be the equivalent of, if I had read it earlier, this is the equivalent for me, and this essay was the same essay for Tom Woods, the Red Pill podcaster, was Lysander Spooner's The Constitution of No Authority. Because when you argue these things, because you're a minarchist or one is a minarchist, right? And they're used to hearing all the lefty arguments and you can handle them all day long. And then someone comes to you from the right and they're like, how are the cops not socialized medicine? How is that not socialism? And then you're like you start spurging out all the lefty arguments, which you know are nonsensical, but since you've never had to do this, those are the only arguments in the zeitgeist, so you just kind of grab onto them because you've never had to consider this. So I feel like if I had not been an anarchist and I read it, the ideas are put forward so clearly and systemically that I'd be like, oh, like the thing that you must have felt, which I felt with Lysander Spooner, was I didn't realize this was on the table.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, this is a thing. And that is so liberating when someone who is presenting a worldview that you knew nothing about, that you, okay, crazy people think this, whatever, sure. And then you read it, you're like, okay, even this guy is wrong. He's not crazy. He's very coherent, very logical, very spelled out. My biggest takeaway, and I tweeted this out, and everyone was all excited, because like, oh, he's back on Rothbard, was that line where he points out that the state is the only agency in a country which gets ahead through coercion. And that line, I'm like, even though I obviously knew that on some level, to see that spelled out, like that this is the essential difference in terms of not just what it is, because Washington talked about what is the state but force, but to say this isn't just what it is, this is how it makes money. Yeah, that is, I think, a big epiphany. Even though I obviously knew that on some level, just to see it spelled out, that really I thought was excellent.
Yeah, so I agree, and for me, it's not as if like I had never heard of the idea of anarchy before I read this. In fact, I went in knowing Murray Rothbard was an anarchist, and I had listened to some anarchists. But if you're, in my opinion, if you're at all even giving anarchy a fair hearing, like if you're like, okay, well, let me see if I can be persuaded by these ideas, he lays out a devastating case, and in Rothbardian fashion, it's just, and this is what I love about the guys in the Misesian lineage, is that what Mises did, if you know, for people out there, if you've read any Mises, it was always a logical train of thought where it's like, I'm going to build everything following the last piece of logic very clearly to the next one and not deviate from that. And this to me is like Rothbard at his best. And there's a few parts of the book that I find that really still stick with me. I actually haven't read it in quite a while, but I've read it multiple times, so I remember enough of it. One of the lines that I thought was really great, well, he's talking about how the state is parasitic in nature, and that it has to take. I hate
that argument. Let's talk about that after. But go ahead. I really hate that argument.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead. Tell me why you hate that argument.
Well, because it's begging the question, because parasitism is natural. Like, I hate this naturalistic fallacy where you're like, well, we should be like nature. Well, there's some matriarchal animals, there's some patriarchal animals, there's some whatever. Parasite. Rand talks about this too. Like, to be a parasite is to be against man. That's a value judgment, whereas many animals, I think it's actually a majority of species, I have to look this up, are parasites. And if you think about it, if one species is going to have several species that parasitize it, you're going to have, so that is a kind of like, I think, bait and switch, which is not intellectually fair.
Well, I agree with you. It's not, I don't think calling the state parasitic is a bait and switch, but saying that goes against nature is to some degree a bait and switch. And he does have a couple lines in there about the state of nature, which I agree with you. That is probably the only part of the book that I actually don't like. And it's very Randian of him.
Yes,
he's really kind of channeling Rand. And I've just never, I do not buy into the kind of libertarian line. I think it's just forcing our desires into the state of nature, to say that it's the state of nature is like non-aggression and us working together, which is like, no, I mean, the state of nature is brutality that we can't even comprehend.
And if you want to be fully pedantic about this, I would rather deal with parasites than with predators. I'd rather have bed bugs in my house than lions in my house. Like, if you really want to go in that direction, I'd rather have the welfare state than Stalin. This isn't, it's not even a hard choice.
Yes, no, I agree.
Predators are more admirable, I guess you could say, but I don't care.
And not that is the choice in front of us, the welfare state or Stalin, and you could prefer neither. But I think it also is reasonable to say I'd rather have the income tax than mass amounts of violent crime. Now, not to say that it's one or the other. I'd rather have neither. But sure, that is a fair point. That you'd rather be like, man, I got to send this check into the IRS once a year, but not live in an area where you think you're going to get shot when you walk outside your door.
I just do want to point out that the point of this episode is two Jews convincing people that being a parasite is appropriate.
That's really where it is. I mean, really, is it really that bad? Just a little bit, a couple of shekels. But anyway, the line that I really love that he said that really I think makes you think. Well, one of the central themes of the work is that the state, of course, by its nature, is begotten by violence and aggression. But he takes on the Marxist idea that the state is protecting the capitalist class and actually argues that the state by its very nature has to be opposed to capitalism. And one of the lines that I really love in the book is that he says, production always precedes predation.
Yes,
so
great line. Randian line.
It's very Randian, and it's very, it's an a priori logical truth. You can't get around that. Obviously, I can't steal something before it's been produced. It would have to be produced first in order for me to steal it, right? In the same way that you can't hold a baby that hasn't been born yet. One has to come before the other by logic. And that's a really interesting way to start thinking about things, to realize that the market activity has to be there first before the state has anything that it can expropriate. That always really hit home with me.
I gotta say, I feel like this must be, I'm never gonna read Man, Economy, and State probably, because I know that that's a tank. And I'm sure a lot of Man, Economy, and State is something have you read the whole thing?
One? No, not the whole thing. Not the whole thing. I've read. I sat down. I mean, I think I've read most of it, but there were parts that I skipped through. It's very technical.
Yeah. So I know I'm never probably going to ever read it, but in the same way, I feel that Man, Economy, and State is taking the ideas of Anatomy of the State and just exploding them into every direction. I feel like Anatomy of the State, as short as it is itself an expansion of one Rothbard quote. And it was the quote I used to start my book, The New Right. The very beginning of The New Right, after the epigram by Sylvia Plath, is Rothbard saying, and indeed, what is the state anyway but organized banditry? What is taxation but theft on a gigantic, unchecked scale? What is war but mass murder on a scale impossible by private police forces? What is conscription but mass enslavement? Can anyone envision a private police force getting away with a tiny fraction of what states get away with and do habitually, year after year, century after century? And that, I think, is Rothbard summed up and our version of anarchism in one paragraph. Just answer me these questions. Fine, the mafia. The thing is, the mafia isn't some hypothetical, Lex Luthor supervillain team. We know what they look like. We know what they do. They do awful things. They traffic, sell drugs, kill their own. But again, the mafia compared to war, they don't want to have war. Even when they're having war with each other, and they're doing their best to minimize it.
Yeah, it really is and that's so much of what anarchists always have to battle with, is that what is the status quo is accepted by most people, because most people aren't creative thinkers, and so this is what is, and so that's just accepted. And what we're asking them to do is to think creatively, and I know it sounds a little bit crazy that it's so there'd be private courts that have agreements with each other, and then they could go to other courts to settle their own disputes.
But can I say one thing? I also love their idea that these private courts or whatever aren't making it easy for the customers.
Right.
Like when you look at Microsoft Office and all these different programs, that they have the smartest minds in different countries doing their best to make it so grandma, who is also blind and illiterate, can figure out how to use this program. They're going backwards for the lowest of the low. But when it came to these private courts who want customers, they're going to make it even harder than now with lawyers.
Well, right. So it's a mix of the fact that they can't, it's hard to wrap their head around this thing that does happen all the time. But also, if your concern is disputes between different groups, the fact that we just take it as kind of a given that there were 2 world wars in the 20th century, which were disputes amongst groups. Like, I mean, and that's just the 2 world wars. That's not counting, like, you know, just the genocides that were committed by governments. It's not counting, you know, Vietnam or Korea or, you know, any of these other horrific things that happened in the 20th century. But that happened, and that's the status quo. So it's like, well, yeah, but our point is like, yeah, it's kind of crazy that we accept that. That's pretty nuts.
What are you going to do? Not have like a Nazi government? Yeah, that's what we're going for. Pretty much.
We could try. We could give that a shot.
Right.
All right, let's take a quick second. I want to thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Lucy.co. Lucy Nicotine is a company founded by former smokers who are finally making tobacco alternatives that don't suck. It's 2020. Get rid of your cigarettes, unplug your vape, throw out your tin of dip, and go get some Lucy nicotine gum or lozenges that actually taste great. I can personally attest to this. They really do taste great. I've tried some of the other products before. Couldn't stand them, some of the gums and lozenges. But at lucy.co, you can get the best ones out there. This is the real deal. I've read lots of testimonials from people who have, you know, it's really saved them. They've gotten off smoking and vaping from this stuff. Go check it out. If you use promo code PROBLEM, they're going to give you your first trial order of gum or lozenges at the lowest price they're allowed by law to charge you. Yes, the wonderful folks at the government have rules against giving nicotine away for free. The team at Lucy is working with us at Gas to get your first trial order of gum for right around $1 and lozenges for about $2. Anyway, go to lucy.co, use the promo code PROBLEM at checkout, get rid of your old cigs or vapes. All right, let's get back into the show. Rothbard, as you said, that quote, I mean, it's perfect. And it is a summation of everything that we stand for. And the first portion of Anatomy of the State is what the state is not. And there's a part there that is one of the main things that sticks out to a lot of people when they read this. Certainly really hit home with me when I first read it, but taking on the idea that we are the government, and he mentions the language of us and we, which still really, I mean, that persists to this day. It is an unbelievable, you know, like, I know there's been great people who have, you know, said things about this before, but controlling language is really such a powerful way to control how people think. And so much of this, you know, still exists where if somebody has a problem with something that the government of China did, it's like, well, China did this. And this is now supposed to represent 1 billion people did this, even though it was a committee that made this decision. We go China, and even people like me and you will speak this way. They say, when we invaded Iraq, we did that, but really we didn't invade Iraq. This is just how we use language. We speak of people and governments as if they're all one thing. Countries are all one thing, and the government represents that whole thing. You know, like, I hate Israel or something like that, but it's like, you might hate a policy of the Israeli government. You know who else hates those policies? About half of Israel. Like, if you talk to Israelis, they're about half of them absolutely hate their government and are like for, I don't know what the exact number are, but a huge percentage of Israelis who are for Palestinian rights and the right to return and all of that. Basically the whole left half of Israel. What he says at one point to take this down, which I think is great, is just that he goes, if we are the government, then all of those Jews in Germany committed suicide. Yeah, which is a great way to put it.
I'm going to give a quote from one of my favorite thinkers, which is Albert Camus, and it really codifies this idea that you're talking about, we versus the government. And he said, I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. I don't want any greatness for it, particularly a greatness born of blood and falsehood. I want to keep it alive by keeping justice alive. And I think, yeah, this patriotism, which is often sneered at by people who are horrible, but is often used as a cudgel to exploit people's good nature, is something that I think everyone needs to have a very nuanced opinion on. Because to think that politicians are thinking about America first instead of themselves and their, you know, vested interests is not historically valid.
Yes. Well, that's another point that Rothbard makes in the book, that he gets into what actually motivates people within the state apparatus. And I thought that was always a very good point. It's one of these things that, which ultimately is, I guess, what a red pill is. But it's one of these things where once you've taken it, you can't unsee it. Even if you want to, it's kind of like you already took this red pill. You don't really have the option to not see this anymore. And what he says is that if you actually look at the actions of the state, they always take the actions that protect themselves. And one of the points that he makes in the book is that basically there are two threats that exist to the state. And there's two ways that states can fall. And it's either a war or a revolution. It can either come from outside or within, but those are the only two. And if you look at it that way, it's very hard to unsee that. You go, well, that's what states are always concerned with. They're concerned with defending a military to defend against state militaries that could conquer them, and they're concerned with propagandizing their own people to support them. And once you look at things that way, everything else kind of makes sense.
It is always surprising to me, or disappointing, I should say, or there's a lot of feelings I have toward this, how willing conservatives are to have the government, which they genuinely hate, like they really do hate it, raise their children. And kind of like feeling like, oh, what are you going to do? And it's like, I don't know how to reconcile it or how they reconcile it. Because I know for a fact that they are crazy about their kids, as everyone is about their kids. And I know for a fact that they do not regard this government as representing them in their values. And somehow they just don't kind of put these two in a Venn diagram, and they just kind of like, oh, what are you going to do? And I'm just like, I'm sorry, I'm not a dad, so I'm talking out of my ass to some extent. You're a dad. But if I knew that these people are the ones training my child, nothing else is on the table. Like, this is the argument I made on Rogan and I've made since. Like, if climate change, like we talked about this on your show, I think, about COVID. If climate change was this issue that they are claiming it is, you're not talking about racism. You're not talking about statues. You're only, if a meteor is facing the Earth, within 10 or 20 or 50 years, we are only talking about the meteor. There's nothing else that is on the table. Everyone only cares about the meteor.
You're not going, oh my God, this meteor is coming right at us, and this guy's making $12 an hour. I really think he should make 15.
Yeah, it's not happening. So if you are aware that this is like your kids are being raised by these people and taught things that not only did you hate, but are going to cause them harm and hurt your country, I don't understand how you're talking about anything else other than abortion. Like that I can wrap my head around. Like, okay, we got to stop the killing of the children, then we have to stop the abuse of the children. Like, I don't get it. And I've heard conservatives talk about it, but nothing that they have said resonated with me emotionally.
It is really something. It's hard for me to wrap my head around it too, where conservatives will, I mean, many of them will believe goofy conspiracy theories, about Obama being a Muslim or something like that, or whatever. That Obama, truly hates America and is in there to destroy this country. But coming after their children, it's like if Obama was then to come after their guns, they would lose their shit. Like that will not be tolerated. But we are going to quite blatantly indoctrinate your children for 12 years, 13 years is that. It's just like, well, that's the way it's got to be. Yeah, I can't solve that one for you. It's very strange.
I think now that we're talking, part of me is thinking that maybe they think, well, I didn't get indoctrinated. So, and the other point is, you did. Because this is why conservatives are so big on saying, oh, when I was a kid, it wasn't like this. No, when you were a kid, you were oblivious. I have this example I'm putting in my forthcoming book. It's like someone who turns 18 and thinks all of a sudden sexual activities through the roof. No, it's just that all your friends are having sex now, and grown-ups were having sex when you were 5, lots of it. You had no way of knowing this was going on. It's just that your awareness has changed now and your ability to spot these things and have conversations. So I think they think, oh, it wasn't this brainwashy when I was a kid. No, it was just effective. Right. That's how effective brainwashing works. It doesn't write brainwashing on the board. It's that you look at it like, oh, they're telling me like an honest, fair truth. And I'm seeing both sides.
Yeah, well, right, and there is something like the nostalgia is a powerful psychological force. I mean, it really is. Like, I can't tell you how. I know you were just reading that book, The Red Decade, which you really like. But you know, I've heard so many conservatives. I've heard liberals as well, but so many conservatives talk about the time when journalists were objective. You know, like there used to be objective journalism, and now there's all these journalists have their agenda, like as if there was not always an agenda, which is, I mean, it's just a completely made up, you know, version of history. But that's, let's just go back to, you know, when the journalists only told the truth. You know, it's, I think that...
they lived through Reagan. That's the thing. Like, Reagan is there. They all have a boner for Reagan, understandably to some extent. But, like, you saw how he was talked about.
Yeah.
Like, so you can't even, so what, if it was good in the 60s? What the hell are you talking about? When Barry Goldwater was about to get us into nuclear war?
Right. I think it's kind of like, you know, sometimes I think it does appeal to autistic libertarian types.
But you repeat yourself.
Yes, right. The idea of like objective journalism. I think of it kind of similarly to that people say when they say we're against identity politics. Like that does, part of it kind of even sounds nice to me because I am an autistic libertarian, and I repeat myself again. But I don't know that it ever really exists. Like, I don't think there's actually ever been an objective journalist, and I don't think there's ever been an absence of identity politics. I mean, it might be an identity that you prefer to the other, like we identify as Americans or something, or but all politics is identity politics to some degree, and that's how people operate.
Yeah, it's amazing how people, well, when there's like certain similarities in our history, and when you point those out, people will hand wave them away because they like one and they don't like the other, so therefore they're not the same, and it's like they are the same, just like one doesn't like the other. Like Joe Biden saying, oh, I'm going to have to pick a black woman or a woman as my vice presidential candidate, oh, why not pick the best person? But historically, for a very long time, you had something called geographical balance, where if I'm a northerner, I'm going to have a southerner on the ticket, right? And it's just like, okay, like it was their version of what we're seeing now. Now, you can make the argument it's worse to pick for gender than it is to pick for geography because you want the ticket to represent the whole country. Yeah, the vice president has no power back in the day. Harry Truman didn't know about, that's what's insane. FDR wasn't in great health. World War II is like one of the biggest crises that this earth has ever seen. You would think that Harry Truman is getting briefed a little bit, right? In case something happens, in case FDR is assassinated. Like, I mean, there's a million scenarios where things go bad or whatever. It's
someone can drop dead at any minute, particularly FDR.
Right, and you don't. He's not dropping because he's sitting, but you know what I mean. But
there's still a little bit to drop. It's a smaller drop.
You would think, all right, this is World War II. We are not messing around. If we're going to have a relay race, we are making sure that baton is handed off easily, and they didn't. So that geographical balance is also a complete canard. Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's not sitting in on him and being like blah, 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 blah. So it's something that we have had historical precedent over, but because when something is happening now and it's happening in a way we don't like, we think, oh my God, this is terrible. And therefore, the point is, it's not that different from what we had in the past.
Yeah. And so even like to your example, if you were saying, oh, well, I prefer, you know, someone picking someone on the grounds of where they're from than their race. Okay, you might prefer one strand of identity politics to the other, but that's not an absence of identity politics. And regardless, even if there is one true Scotsman autist out there who is like, I really have no identity and just live in the world of logic, you're pretty much alone. And everybody else is concerned with their identity, whether you like it or not. Now, you can say that identity politics should be tamed as much as possible, and that it shouldn't. Yes, it's obviously this is a cartoonish, ridiculous version of it that we see on the left, where your qualification is your identity, and that's stupid. But most people, their identity means something to them, and the truth is that all of us in this country have different reactions toward different types of identity politics, and that you might be able to defend that for, like, there might be good reason for that. Now, if somebody were to say, you know, like, I'm a proud Italian and I really love Italian culture and Italian music and Italian food, that doesn't really ruffle too many feathers. If someone said, European culture and European traditions, that ruffles more feathers. And if someone said white power and white culture, that like really gets a reaction out of people. Now that might be justified, but all of those are identity politics. And then, you know, on the other side, if someone said, hey, listen, I'm a black man and what I care about is a healthy society for my you know, black kids, and I want black communities and black businesses to do well, that is generally not seen as being nearly as problematic as if a white person said the same thing. Now, that might be fair, given the state of things in this country and the history of the country. But it's still, let's not pretend we're just against identity politics. There's one identity that you don't like.
There's the devil's argument, the advocate argument we made here, which is like, yeah, but when you have that you're going to have to pick a woman as your VP, what you're validating is men not getting hired for certain positions because you're modeling what your company should look like vis-a-vis the presidency and the vice presidency. And I think that is a fair argument. At the same time, you have to realize you could also very easily look at it as validating white supremacy, because the Democrats are nominating the oldest, whitest man in this country, and he's at the top of that ticket. And they did everything in their power to make sure that that oldest, whitest man is at the top of the ticket. So a lot of this depends on perspective. I'm not saying this isn't a threat. I'm not saying this isn't an issue in America. But what people need to appreciate is there will always be an outgroup which will leverage whatever power it can to try to get itself further ahead. And it will use arguments that are fair or reasonable and use arguments that are nonsensical, whatever works to get that group ahead. And people identify themselves by opposition. So what I talk about in my book, if you have a group of kids and adults, the kids will think of themselves as kids. If you just have a group of kids, they'll think of themselves as boys and girls. They'll split up. So very easily it could be like race thing, but then it could just as easily be like Joe Biden's old. This happened in '92. You had George Bush is old, and Bill Clinton and Al Gore are the young people. So they did identity politics on, I don't want to call it identity politics, but kind of what you're saying, on the basis of age. So there will always be some need to be like, we're going to draw the circle. Where do you draw your border to get the 51%? Right. It could be on race, it could be on geography, but it's inevitable that some of these things will happen. Now, you could say some are more legitimate than others, sure. And some are certainly much more illegitimate than others. But this is something that you shouldn't be surprised that people are going to exploit.
Yeah, absolutely. And to tie things back in, the state operates by exploiting these differences. I mean, that's like the first rule to be a ruler is that you have to exploit the differences amongst the classes that you're ruling. So back to Anatomy of the State. Rothbard, after going through the chapter of what the state is not, goes into what the state is and makes what is, to me, a conclusive argument that in order for me to take anyone's argument seriously, they can't avoid this kind of Rothbardian point, which of course is not unique to Rothbard, and he quotes other people in the pamphlet. But again, I would also say that this is central to all, the whole business that we're in, which is that if you objectively look at what the state is, it's not us, it's not mountains and hills, it's not a flag, it is the group of people in society who are fighting to maintain a legal right on the initiation of violence. Yeah. And that to me is that's the fundamental libertarian or anarcho-capitalist or whatever realization. So obviously I knew you reading this, obviously you've known about this stuff for a long time, but what did you think about that, how he put it?
Because this is like the basis of kind of my worldview. This is, I mean, Rand talked about this. She beat that point to death in far more verbose speeches in Atlas Shrugged. So I was very familiar with this. What's clicking in my head, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I don't know that you're going to have a quick answer, because I don't know that I do. Which is a bigger red pill, Anatomy of the State or the Constitution of No Authority?
I read the Constitution of No Authority way after Anatomy of the State. Okay. Yeah, so I realized it was written before.
Sure,
but it was but yeah, I didn't read any Spooner until like I had been an anarchist forever. So for Spooner, I thought made really great arguments, and it was like, oh, there's been a guy who's like this forever. So I don't know that I have an answer. I think it might depend on which you read first.
Yeah, but I feel like it's a lot easier for someone to wrap their heads around Spooner than it is to wrap their heads around the arguments in Rothbard, because all Spooner is saying is that the Constitution is BS. He's just putting doubt in your head. Rothbard's giving you kind of answers, and that's a lot harder, I think, for people to make that cognitive leap. So what I would do is I would give them, like, first you got to tell them it's a problem, then you got to give them the solution. So I would sit someone down and say, read Spooner, and then immediately after read Anatomy of the State.
Yeah, well, that's reasonable. My favorite insight from Spooner, which I always love, I find just so fascinating, is that he argues that politicians are actually bound by the Constitution, that you can still reject the Constitution completely and say that has no authority on me, but they are bound by the Constitution. So you can still be outraged when they violate the Constitution, because you're like, you know what? You did swear an oath to this document. So you are actually bound by it. So you can simultaneously be like, this is a piece of paper written hundreds of years ago. I don't care. I'm not bound by it. And also still be like, John McCain can be tried for violating the Constitution. Not anymore, but a few years ago, he could have been.
You could still try him.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, let's do it. Maybe that'll be our next podcast.
Did you see that letter I got from the Lysander Spooner Company? Did I show it to you?
I don't think so.
Oh, pause 30 seconds. This will be a cool moment.
Sure, absolutely.
So Lysander Spooner, in addition to being, I think, the strongest anti-constitutionalist, was also famous because he had a private post office. And he pointed out, just because the Constitution it authorizes the federal government to run a post office doesn't mean it makes it illegal for private citizens to do it as well. And he did it, and he ran circles around them, and they kept suing him and ran him into the ground. So I have here from 1832 maybe. This is a Lysander. This is from the company. This is his stamp. This was sent, I got this on eBay, and this was sent to Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And I looked up the guy, which is even cooler, and it says over here, it's hard to read, but it's American SS whatever. He founded the American Sunday School system. And there's several letters to him that have been addressed. So I got this, and I think I got to get a frame for it. But yeah.
That is really cool. You always have an endless supply of cool random things that I would never think to get, but I would be like, oh, that would be really cool to have.
You mean like a pen made out of a warthog tusk from South Africa?
See, now you're repeating.